Hi, I'm Christopher Warnock of Renaissance Astrology, and today I'd like to talk about orbs and invisibility. And so, as has sort of become the way I do these videos now, I typically have a sort of an astrological topic, but to get there, we end up doing a lot of background. And what I've really been getting interested in is this whole sort of using worldview models and then heuristics as a way of understanding how we do our practice. Because I think there's a tendency to sort of just jump in and just do it, get impatient with this philosophical stuff. And then what happens is that you're totally controlled then by worldview, model, and heuristics. So in this video, we're going to talk about heuristics. So this is a term. A heuristic is, again, it's funny, you read the literature, it's sort of by scientists, and they tend to be very, cranky about heuristics, and they're not rational. It's like, basically what a heuristic is sort of a rough guide. It's kind of almost, you could call it common sense. There's lots of different sort of preset ways of doing things. So, for example, going into a store and you want to buy, something, and there's a bunch of different options, and you want to get the best one, so you get the most expensive one. So the automatic is, that the heuristic as well, if it's the best one, will be the most expensive one. Well, I mean, that may or may not be true. I mean, probably the cheapest one isn't necessarily the best one. I mean, that wouldn't necessarily be true. But you can see how that works. It's like you just don't have time to look into all this stuff. You need some kind of a, quick answer, and you've got some sort of basis for it. It's not totally random, and it's not totally crazy. So that's basically, and we use them all the time. And to complain about heuristics, everybody has to use heuristics. You've got to have some sort of these rough guides that you use for things because you have a million decisions to make all day long. Now, the only thing that's a problem with it is that you don't recognize it as a heuristic. And so it's useful to be conscious of it and useful to see the modeling and heuristic as you're doing it. But I'm not by any means saying it's bad. I just think it's interesting to see these operating. And if you're conscious of it, then you're not unconsciously controlled by it. And that's useful. You can maybe make a little bit more choice in the matter, and you can at least see it operating. So basically, I'm going to talk about orbs today, orbs of aspects. And so my model in the heuristic that I use is different from the standard. And again, I wouldn't say it's best, but again, this is useful to see how I think about it. And then it also sort of exposes how the standard, approach to orbs, and the standard heuristics kind of come into play. So when we're talking about orbs, first of all, they're only used in aspects by degree. They're not used in sign to sign. I mean, if everything, if any planet, the two planets are in Aries, so their conjunct is in Hellenistic, there's obviously not going to be any difference in terms of the orb because they're not getting closer or further away. They're either in the sign or they're not in the sign. But when you have an aspect by degree, that aspect is going to be exact at a certain point. Whenever, for example, if it's a conjunction, when both planets are exactly the same zodiacal longitude, sextile when they're exactly 60 degrees apart, square when they're actually 90 degrees apart, etc., etc. So that when they're exact, that's in traditional astrology is referred to as the perfection of the aspect, or the aspect is perfected. So with these aspects, by degree, at a certain point they're out of aspect. They're not anywhere near each other, so there's no effect. But as they get closer and closer to being perfected, the aspect gets stronger and stronger. And so that separation, there's reached a certain distance where you say, okay, we're going to consider the aspect to be in operation. It's not perfected yet, but it's operating. It's close enough that we're going to take notice of that aspect. And so the way they do that is called an orb. So, there's varying, again, it's very much depends on the circumstances, what kind of astrology you're using. So, for example, if the orb was 10 degrees and they're 10 degrees away, 9 degrees away, then they're in orb. So you take that, you look at that aspect, you'd say it's effective. In medieval Renaissance astrology, they use the orbs are by planet. I think in modern they're by sign. I don't know. But medieval astrology is by planet. Each planet has different, the moon and sun have the biggest orbs, and then each planet is different. And there's all sorts of different tables. And so then what you do is you take half the orb, and that's called the moiety. And then if the two planets are in aspect, you add each other's moiety, and then you get the orb, blah, blah, blah. Really complicated process. And William Lilly in his Christian Astrology at page 107 has a table with all these different orbs and numbers and everything like that. So my students will, see that. They'll pitch in and start learning all this stuff and orbs and moieties and everything. And then when they get to using them, I say, oh, well, I don't really use strict orbs. And it's funny because Lilly actually says this. He says about the different orbs, he says, well, sometimes they use one and sometimes the other. So it's all set up to be the strict. I think we kind of want to click into this rules and exactly what it is. And it kind of reminds me of the Master Chef, and they say, I'm making the recipe. It's like, how much butter do you use? He says, I use a honk. You say, a honk? How much is a honk? He says, well, you just know. And that's basically it. Your skill and your experience allows you to intuit what the appropriate amount is in that circumstance. So it's amazing. It's like my wife. She's such an amazing chef. She never uses a recipe. She can do everything from scratch, and make amazing food. And so that's just, at a certain point, you don't need to follow all these strict rules because you understand the essence of it. That's a little frustrating. A very typical traditional astrology. You learn something and you don't have to use it, or it's not used that way anymore. It's like, why are we learning this? It's like it's part of the tradition. And when you throw it out, then later you figure out why it was there. They're a little bit more willing to accept stuff as being part of the tradition as opposed to explain to me and I have to be satisfied about what everything is, or I'm not going to use it, which is a more modern approach. Again, just sort of a different approach. So again, as I was saying with these tables and strict things, this seems like the modern approach. It's sort of automatic. It's almost like scientific. It's going to be exact. And so it treats the orb kind of like a cliff. So if you have an 8-degree orb, that aspect is completely effective until 7 degrees 59 minutes, and then it's utterly ineffective at 8 degrees and 1 minute. It just disappears, basically. It's not even important. My model is that an orb is sort of like a gently sloping hill, and the power gradually increases and it suddenly doesn't disappear. I mean, even a separation, there's still some sort of lingering effect. The type is different. So the thing is that as you're away from the orb, it's not like it's not existent. It's just at a very low level. And so, when you start taking that into consideration is, it's you can see why that's kind of iffy. And treating it as a cliff is, when you have that strict boundary, you're losing some nuance. So, what I do typically with my software is I set the orbs really wide, like 14 or 15 degrees. And so that way I can see all the aspects that are going on there, even before they would be considered to be effective. And so what I was noticing was that students would say, well, why did you make this talisman? It's like, the moon is squaring, Saturn. I look at the chart and the moon is like applying to square Saturn like 14 degrees away or 13 degrees. And I'm like, well, that's not something I would be concerned about. But they're like, oh, I can see it. So that was really interesting to me, and that's what kind of started this whole thinking about this video. Was this heuristic? Was the heuristic is basically, if it's visible, it's significant, and if it's invisible, it's not important, and it's even non-existent. And you could expand that to say if I'm aware of it, it's important. If I'm not aware of it, it's not significant. So that's a really interesting heuristic. If you think about a movie or TV plot, if something shows up in the plot, if a person or something happens, everything that happens is important, right? You just normally in a movie, like if they mention something, there's an axe on the wall, and look at it, it's like that axe is going to come into the plot later and it's going to be important at some point. I mean, everything that happens is important. And so it's almost like that's sort of a natural approach, but that's not really how life works. I mean, you have lots of stuff that's going on in your life, and it may or may not be significant for anything. Now, there's a tendency to see stuff, I know what happened, I saw that, rose and then I fell down the stairs or whatever. I mean, my view is that everything is patterned. The thing is, we don't know what the significance of that patterning is, and it may not even necessarily be very closely related to us. And people are like, I know what this and that, but it tends to all be after the fact, and they can't predict it in advance. So that patterning is, again, like I said, my belief is that everything is patterned, but again, what the significance of that pattern is not always clear, though. But this idea that if I can see it, it's important, and if I don't see it, it's not important, does repeatedly crop up in astrology. For example, like I said, this whole orb setting thing, obviously, what happens is you set the orbs and you don't even see it, right? If it's an 8-degree orb and it's eight degrees in 1 minute, it's not even showing up on the chart, So it's boom, it's gone. It's insignificant. And then you sort of see the flip of that in what people will look at like horary or lectional, and they'll start wandering all over the chart, and I have a horary that's talking about marriage, and so the houses we're going to be looking at are the first house for one of the parties and the seventh house for the other party, and the planets and the rulers of those houses and planets in those houses, and that's pretty much it. We're not going to be looking at the third house, for example. It's just normally not going to come up. But people start wandering around because they're used to that from natal. Everything in a natal chart is important. Everything is important. It relates to some part of your life. But a horary chart, no. Lectional chart, no. I mean, it's like, in that we focus. There's only certain things that are going to be significant enough to be looking at. Another example of that is that, again, in medieval Renaissance astrology, we use the 7 visible planets. And people would come in and say, well, you have to use up Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. After all, they're there, right? So if we can see them, then they must be important and we have to use them. So, I mean, that's, again, sort of the corollary of it. So I just thought that was interesting. Like I said, it was funny to see, again, my students repeatedly, again, if they can see the orb on the chart, then it must be significant, as opposed to actually making a choice. So what's happening in that is that by the way you set your software, the software is choosing for you. You've kind of given up your choice there and your awareness there and again, you're cutting down. You can't see everything. So there's going to be a level of that. But my preference with that, like I said, is to set those orbs wide and to see the aspects and then to make a conscious choice. And I'm very variable about it. I mean, sometimes students will say, well, it's like, a square is 10 degrees away from the talisman that they're trying to elect, Jupiter or whatever. And I'm like, well, that's getting kind of close. Watch out for that. And maybe you would prefer to not have it, but it's usable. So again, you're starting to make these much more nuanced choices as opposed to like, okay, 8-degree orb, boom, it's not even there. And so that's what I would say. It really brings up, I think, a deeper issue about this, which is that it's really useful to be aware of the heuristics and models that you're operating under, and to not assume that that's just, oh, that's reality, that's the way it is. Anyone that disagrees with me is crazy. How could it not be this way? Of course it's this way. If you're thinking like that, you're in the grip of unconscious worldview models and heuristics. And so that's something that's, because what you recognize too with it is, oh, this is a model and it's possible to have another model, right? And there's actually advantages and disadvantages in each model. I mean, like I said, if you set the orbs, you don't see it, then you don't have to think about it. You don't have to worry about it. The way I'm doing it is a little confusing. It's like it's that master chef method where it's like you don't have rules, you're just kind of intuiting everything. So again, advantages and disadvantages to stuff. My overall, impetus though is to say, look, I'd prefer to be aware of the stuff and aware of what modeling I'm using. So again, that's what's useful for me. And as I go through this, what I'm finding increasingly is that this whole underlying sort of metastructure is becoming what I'm really fascinated with. Because what you recognize with it is that there's all these underlying structures to how we do things. These all come into play before we actually do what we think, oh, it's just practical, we're ignoring that stuff. All that stuff is actually very important and comes into play in what we're doing. So very interesting. The orb stuff, again, there's a little practical stuff of what I do, but also, like I said, the continuing discussion and interest that I have in the metastructures of astrology. So I hope you find that interesting, and I look forward to delving into these issues further as I go forward.